Hi, science friends. Yesterday we talked about species diversity, but today I want to talk about disturbances and how they affect diversity. So let's first address what a disturbance is. So a disturbance is anything that happens in an ecosystem that causes a great change to the ecosystem. So that could be like flooding, a fire, human activity, a major storm, anything like that that's going to greatly impact the ecosystem. And so most communities are constantly kind of going through these events. And for that reason, they are constantly changing because they're being affected by these disturbances. The non-equilibrium model tells us that ecosystems don't really get to a level of equilibrium where they're, they don't have like a normal per se. They just don't really exist in equilibrium. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis, though, tells us that the most amount of species are going to be fostered when the disturbance is at an intermediate level. So here over on the left, we see number of taxa. Taxa are just species. That represents the word taxon, which are families or groups. And so the most taxon are found when the disturbance level is in the middle, when it's at that intermediate level. If you have too much disturbances, then too many disturbances, then the species can't really adapt to that change, and that's going to greatly reduce the number of taxa. Or if you have too few disturbances, what we generally see is that there are a few really dominant species that will kind of take over and basically outcompete everything else. And so ideally, in order to have the number of taxa, you need these moderate disturbances that allow for multiple different niche to form and species just to really adapt to kind of fit that environment. So that's what the intermediate disturbance hypothesis talks about. So anytime you have a major disturbance and an ecosystem or a community has to recover from that, that is called succession. So the transition of a community following an environmental disturbance, that is ecological succession. So there's two types of ecological succession. You can have primary succession or secondary succession. And so the major difference of those is whether or not soil is there. So primary succession occurs where there's no soil present. Secondary succession is going to occur where there is soil present. So this is going to be after something like primary succession after like a volcano. So when that lava forms over the area and it hardens and it's like that, that rock, that is going to be primary succession. You're not really going to have, I can't really think of a whole lot of other events that would cause primary succession. After a fire or flooding, a major storm, anything like that, those are going to be secondary succession because the soil is still going to remain. So primary succession is obviously going to take a little bit of a longer time to recover from because there's no soil there, and so it's hard for the plant life to begin to grow back. So in this picture at the bottom, you see a fire after a fire on the left, and then 1 year later on the right. And so you see that ecosystem, that community has pretty well recovered in that time. So that's an example of secondary succession because there was soil to start that recovery. So obviously one of the most impactful disturbances is that humans are involved in, human disturbances. So we're the strongest agents of disturbance. We do a lot of different things that have a negative impact on ecosystems. So agricultural, developing things for agricultural, farming, logging, urban development, so building cities, building roads, building highways, mining, farming, overgrazing, so allowing cattle to or other animals to overgraze the area, and then ocean trawling. That's when they drag the big weighted nets across the ocean floor. That affects an area the size of like South America every single year, and so those are major disturbances that ecosystems have to recover from as well, and these things take time. So yesterday we talked a lot about species diversity, and we mentioned that species diversity was greatest like in the rainforest. But more generally, I'm going to use the term here today is in the tropics. It's greatest in the tropics. And the reason why that is has to do with solar input and water availability. And so solar input and water availability is measured in something called evapotranspiration. So what evapotranspiration is evaporation plus transpiration equals evapotranspiration. Now, you probably already know what evaporation is. That's just when water is being drawn up out of the ground. But transpiration is a little bit more specific. Transpiration is the evaporation from the leaves of plants. It's a very, sorry, I'm trying to talk and write at the same time. Transpiration is very specific, evaporation from the leaves of plants. And so when we put those things together, it kind of altogether encompasses solar input and water availability. If you have a high level of evapotranspiration, that means you had a high level of water availability to start with. It also means that you had a high level of solar input to allow for that much evaporation to occur, because we all know that evaporation happens more at higher temperatures, right? And so measuring evapotranspiration accounts for both of those qualities that increases species diversity. So both of these graphs just show that if you have more evapotranspiration, then you have more species richness. Same thing over here. Species richness is going to increase with the evapotranspiration that's there. And so that's why in the tropics, there's a great deal of solar input. There's also a lot of steady rain. And so there's the most species diversity in the tropics. Another place where you see more species diversity is in a larger geographic area. And that's what this graph shows. As the geographic area increases, the number of species increase. And that, of course, makes perfect sense. Species are spread out a little bit more. There are more habitats for them to occupy. There's, maybe less competition for resources because they're not all on top of one another. And so the more space they have, the larger the area, then the more species diversity there will be. Okay? Now, one other thing that we can look at with species diversity and the number of species in an area is called the island equilibrium model. And so it's specifically studying islands. So in this first graph, we see the number of species on the island. So as the number of species increases, what you see start to happen is immigration decreases. And that makes perfect sense. If there's not very many species on the island, then there's going to be a lot of immigration because there's probably not as much competition. There's plenty of resources. And not very many species are going to go extinct either. But as the number of species increases, the extinction rates are going to go up, which makes sense. There's more competition. And the immigration rates are going to go down because there's not enough resources for all of the organisms that are living there. And so new species are less likely to come and inhabit that area. Okay? Now, in this second graph, graph B, notice that the lines are the same. We're still looking at immigration and extinction. And the curve patterns are still the same. The red is still going down to the right, and the black is still going up to the right. But the differences that we're looking at is a large island and a small island. And so the number of species on an island is greater on a larger island than it is a smaller island. And again here, the number of species on a island is that go extinct is more on a large island and less on a small island. For immigration, a large island has a higher level of immigration than a small island just because more organisms are apt to find it. If you have a small island, it's less likely that they will get blown there or, land there or whatever by chance than if you have a big island. And so that's why immigration is greater on a big island than a small island. Okay? Extinction is greater on a small island because there are fewer habitats and less resources. On a large island, extinction is less because there's more habitats and more resources. Okay? Now, let's look at the last graph, graph C. This graph is looking at the distance from the mainland, so an island off of kind of the coast of a mainland. So if the island is near the mainland, you're going to have more immigration, and that makes perfect sense because it's easier for them to get there. If the island is far from the mainland, you'll have less immigration because it's going to be harder for them to get there. Okay? Let's look at the extinction now. If the island is far from the mainland, you're going to have more extinction. Okay? And if the island is nearer the mainland, you're going to have less extinction, perhaps because they can get back to the mainland and still get some of the resources that they need. Okay? So that's what the island equilibrium model shows. I just wanted to go over it. Probably not going to see it on an AP test, but it just kind of goes in with the species diversity that we've talked about, and basically is common sense if you ask me. Okay? Now, last thing I want to talk about that has a great impact on species diversity is pathogens. So we talked about pathogens before. Pathogens are anything that cause disease. So that can be microorganisms like bacteria, that can be viruses that contain DNA or RNA as their genetic material. Viroids, we haven't really talked about those, but those are basically they're not quite as complicated as a virus. They have a protein code and some nucleic acid in the middle, but they only affect plants. And then prions, those are infectious proteins. And so all of these can affect not only humans, but they also affect animals and plant life as well, and they impact species diversity. So sometimes they will wipe out like a host species. So in like the early 1900s, from like 1910 to 1950, there was like the Great Chestnut Blight in New York City that killed like every single chestnut tree in New York City, caused by some type of fungus infection. Sometimes these things are introduced by like horticultural trade, could literally wipe out millions of trees. And then as they wipe out trees, it's not just the trees that become extinct, it's often the birds that live in those trees or butterfly species that like feed on those trees, and different things like that. And so it can cause a major change in an ecosystem or in a community, whatever. Any type of pathogen that is transferred to humans from an animal, the animal is called the vector. Like a tick, for example, would be a vector for Lyme disease. Those are called zoonotic pathogens. And so approximately 75% of pathogens are zoonotic pathogens. Unknown pathogens are killing the coral reefs. That's having a great effect on marine diversity in those types of biomes, because the organisms that use that for to help them hide where they live, that's their habitat, that's really reducing those those habitats and those resources for organisms there. So pathogens are a big thing, and they also cause disturbances, and they also reduce species diversity. So I hope all that all makes sense. If you have any questions about it, make a little note and we can go over it on tomorrow. But if not, then you have a timber lab to complete. And so there's about a 5-minute video for you to review if you have any questions on that. And then after that, you'll work on your interspecies interactions activity that we've been working on the past couple of days. And that'll be all for today. That's due tonight via email. and let me know if you have any questions. And if not, then you'll have a great day.